Hello, everybody. My name is KirkpattieCake. I'm an author and robot, and today, well, I've had kind of a hard week, so I figured we would look at some Reddit writing questions and have some conversation. Obviously, I'm going to present them to you guys. I'm going to present, my opinion. We can have some discussions, but there is a never-ending flow of questions. But before we get started, a couple of things. Number one, Pitch Fit for season 3 for quarter 3 is now currently open. If you are a creative and you would like to pitch your book on this channel, check out that link and submit it. And we are about to have our first Pitch Fit event on this channel. Saturday, be there. It'll be a good time. Maybe you'll find some books you want to read. So with that said, number 2 is the... Oh my gosh. Number 2 is... LBRY. This is the last week to get that in. So if you would like to participate in LBRY on this channel, check out that link in the description down below. And with that said, let's get started. I'm looking forward to some questions. There's never-ending supply of questions on Reddit. And the cool thing about answering these kinds of questions is, one, they're common questions. They're regular questions that just normal people have, and we can all offer our perspective on what we've got. And that's one of the cool things with the writing community, especially, is there is no one way to do stuff correctly, because we all bring our different experiences, different opinions, different writing styles to the mix, and what has helped us and what hasn't helped us. In my opinion, the best way to develop as an author is, 1, to read, and 2, you hear what other people do, and maybe if you're struggling with something, you try on one of their fixes, or you get some of their perspective, and maybe it works and maybe it doesn't. But there isn't any one way to solve your writing problems. So I'm sorry, Stephen King on writing. That might be where everybody usually goes for writing advice, but there is more to say on writing than Stephen King's on writing. Anyway, let's get into it. Let's see what some questions going around the community are. And all I see is, unable to write likable characters due to not being likable as a person. How do you keep your personal flaws from seeping into your writing? Is this a common thing? Oh no. Oh no. So a while ago, dude. Well, if you're not self-inserting, I mean, my first thing is, if you're not self-inserting, but 2, it depends. I'll get into this in a second, but I do think that your character, like your individual character, influences the way that you write. It'll influence your perspective. It'll influence the way your characters interact. And that's one of the reasons why I can't read certain people enjoyably if they have really snotty attitudes, because you can see the seeping hatred, or at least I can. You can sometimes feel the seeping hatred that the author has for certain characters, and I don't really mind writing terrible characters or reading terrible characters, but I do mind reading like blatant hatred, and that will turn me off of something. Or when like the author comes off as being like really cocky or mean. There's a playful nature in writing, even in dark stuff. There's a vibe. There's a vibe that bothers me. Let me know if there are like if you catch vibes when you're reading that you're like, I'm not sure about this one. But let's get into the actual question here. So a while ago, I finished my first full manuscript, at least the first that I wrote with the intentions of sharing it publicly, which I knew had many flaws and, like any manuscript, would require substantial rewrites. I had a few beta readers go through the draft, and there was one thing in particular that everyone had very strong negative reactions to: the characters, especially the main character. Even though there were many other things fundamentally wrong with the story, so much so that I eventually decided to scrap it all together and look for a more queryable concept, this absolutely visceral and rant-inducing reception of the characters really strung me, because I legitimately thought that it was actually one of my few strengths, and aside from one exception, I really managed to make the main cast likable, or at least neutral, since the latter half of the draft I was just running on fumes and was focusing more on getting it done, rather than fleshing the character traits out. But the character, who was supposed to be a sad, sympathetic villain, only caused shrugs. The fun, old, eccentric mentor guy came across as infantile and annoying. And the protagonist, The first beta reader I had, who once seemed to honestly really like the main character and was engaged with the story, got back to me after they finished with the most scathing feedback I have ever received. The MC was supposed to be this nice, slightly pathetic everyman and an underdog, a naive dreamer who keeps getting the short end of the stick, but he ended up as a self-absorbed, covert narcissist and a user who keeps taking advantage of everybody around without ever learning anything or suffering any consequences. And when I was reading this critique, I could no longer tell whether the beta reader was talking about the story or about me. Oof. Ooh, that's like your first mistake. Never take critiques personally, even when the critiquer makes it personal, because I've had some personal attacks and critiques and reviews. You don't. You just don't. And that's the problem I don't know what to do with, because I know that it will come back when I start some future project. I may scrap this one and start over, but I am still the same dysfunctional, insecure, depressed person who has a very big problem interacting with people without making it about myself. I used to consider writing a way to escape that and grow as a person, to develop more social sensibilities and understand other people's perspectives, but it only seems to affirm my flaws. I cannot fully detach my characters from myself, which is going to remain a huge obstacle. So I need to ask you, is it even possible to fully detach yourself from your writing? Can you apply the death of the author thing to yourself and write a story without having your own life issues and personal flaws seeping into it? Do any of you struggle with anything similar to this with your work? So the one thing that I can say where I feel like my personal flaws seep into what I write is that I call myself a robot for a reason. I'm not an overly emotional person unless you bring up like dying pets, and then the second that you do, my eyes start to water and I start crying. I'm already feeling it right now. So there is just like that one thing where I'm like, I can't anything. But I'm more or less emotionally detached. I'm not super responsive to a lot of stuff. Like internally, I don't really know what feelings feel like in a lot of ways. And I often feel like a freak for that. You know, I listen to people talk about having their emotional experiences and emotional responses to writing or to books or to storytelling, and I have no idea what that means. To get emotionally connected to characters, I have no idea what that means. And so in my stories, I've noticed, and especially because of my writing partner, so I'll bring that up too. But my stories tend to not be like super heavily emotionally charged, and often my character archetypes for the stories that I tell are either a naive individual or a psychopathic individual, but somebody that has muted emotional responses in some ways. I'm going to say Joey in my upcoming novel, Bleed More, Body More, comes out in October. She's not psychopathic, but I would say she does stunt her emotional responses. She suppresses it a lot because of the trauma that she's been through. And that's kind of just the way that I write, because I'm personally not a super emotional responsive person. But then, like I said, with my writing partner, my creative partner in every single way, he is the emotional one out of the two of us, and his characters always have like a lot of heart and a lot of feelings. And it's very funny because when we write together, his are the ones with a bunch of feelings, and mine are usually the kind of emotionally muted ones, or I don't even want to say stoic, because they're just not overly feely. They do have feelings, but in a comparison, if you had us write the same scene, his would be more emotionally piercing because he has more of a tap into emotion. So anyway, all of this is just saying that's a weakness of mine that bleeds into my writing. However, I'm not personally living through any of my characters, which is one of the things a lot of people actually do write, is they write characters to be avatars for themselves. I think I had another writing friend who recently brought this up to me, and I never thought about it before, but it does make sense. There are these two main styles of writing. One is the avatar writer, which is writing as a second life. A lot of people write, a version of themselves or an OP version of themselves, or they tell their life stories, their past through fictionalized versions of their lives. And then you've got the other one that goes through writing an experience unlike themselves, not trying to live like themselves. But if you're writing your character or your story to live this OP life or to live out this fantasy, then you're always going to be much more close to that fiction, and it's always going to probably feel a little more personal when you get critique and feedback returned. Feedback is always going to feel like a personal blow. Even as a non-emotional person, I go, ugh, I'm a failure. Why do I feel like such a failure for every little thing that I do? And that's without an emotional response. I'm just like, I don't know how to make this better. How do I make a better product? But if you are emotionally attached to your characters and you feel like you're living through your characters or your character is very much like you, then that's going to feel like a personal attack, regardless of whether the critiquer or the feedbacker meant for it to be a personal attack, because you are associating with a character. The best thing that you can do for yourself is to separate yourself from that character if you, at least when you get into feedback, because let me tell you, your critiquers that you know personally, your beta readers, if they're in your friend circle or a trusted circle of writers, they're going to be nicer to you than strangers who have no allegiance to you, don't know your name, don't know your face, don't know anything. They can be plenty more brutal, that's for sure. And it does not... Bad feedback will never go away if you're creating a book. Just think of some of the things that people have said about movies or video games in the last couple of years. Like, dude, the blowback for the Game of Thrones finale season was intense, and I don't even watch that show. My recommendation for this is there are a lot of books out there where somebody is writing a personal fantasy or a character fantasy of some kind. They may not even realize that it's what they're doing, but you can find those books. I would say the Fighting Storm trilogy that I just read came off like a personal fantasy to me because you had that OP character. I actually have found a lot of sci-fi fantasy stories or light sci-fi fantasy stories that have a female action hero as the main character that often come off as personal fantasies. And where you typically end up with that self-absorbed, covert, narcissist person is somebody that puts their needs first. They don't really notice other people. There are never consequences to their actions. And I bring up reading other stories that are kind of like what you have done, so that you can see what it looks like when somebody else is making the same mistakes you are. Because sometimes it's a lot easier to see what those mistakes look like and how they come off to somebody not familiar with the work when you see them in other people's work. So I think recently I heard about Empress Teresa is a good one to go look at for another one of these situations. If, like I said, you could also go and watch my videos that I did on this channel for the Fighting Trilogy, and I kind of line out the Fighting Storm Trilogy, and I kind of line up how these characters come across, and most often it is just the character pushing their way through, getting what they want, getting in fights with people, yelling at people, berating people, and nobody notices them doing it, and or they just say, "You're awesome," because it's the main character. So then they come off as using. What really, really makes these characters typically like this is there being no consequence. So they continually act the same way where they're taking, or they're being dicks to everybody, and there's never any change. And that's often what leads to this, well, I thought my character was like this, but but I'm being told that they are self-absorbed to this other thing. Yes, because just because nobody in the story calls them out on it doesn't mean that the readers don't notice. In my opinion, consequences are one of the most important things that need to come out for some person to not be a sue or a misrepresented individual like this. Also, it's always just a mistake to take any critique personally, even when they say, "This author, fuck you," because I have seen that in the last couple of weeks. Just don't take it personally. This person doesn't know you. When writing, are you ever troubled with the thought, "Who cares?" All the time. All the time. My best friend will tell you I message him regularly with, "What the frick am I doing?" We'll get more into that. I'm currently working on chapter 11 of book 2 in my trilogy, but this problem has followed me throughout the whole process, and it will continue to follow you, trust me. I'm at the point in the story where things are pretty tense and the main character is almost at a breaking point, but as I'm writing her struggles and anguish, I keep getting the thought, "Who cares? Who cares about this person I created in my head and the troubles that they go through and the things that matter to them?" I know it's irrational because I personally get pretty easily invested in other people's stories. I have to read but a sentence where Amy is 16 and she's excited to start a new school, and I'm instantly like, "OMG, what is going to happen to Amy?" So this is entirely normal. I think it happens to most people. It definitely happens to me. Even this last week, I think even yesterday, I was like this. Last week, definitely. I keep looking at my current project, boom, 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 and I'm like, "What the frick am I doing?" And the whole time that I was working on Bleed More, Body More, comes out in October. Whether I was revising it or I was just editing it, because I went through it so many times to edit it, or I was getting feedback on it, I was just like, "What am I doing? This is so dumb. Why am I like this?" Why am I even bothering to put this stuff up there? And I mean, I guess I could stop. That's always how my brain works. And I'm like, this is so dumb. I should probably stop, but then I don't. But I still wonder, why does it matter? Nobody wants this. Nobody is asking for this. Here, have it anyway. But this is typically what I call, well, it's in what I call writer's whiplash, where sometimes you're reading this area of your story, and you're like, this is fantastic. And then 10 minutes later, you're working on another part, and you're like, oh my gosh, what the frick am I doing with my life? This is so freaking terrible. Who cares? So this is just normal, and the only thing that you can really, really do is push through it and continue to work. Like, your choices are, if you ask who cares, okay, so you can either say who cares and keep going, or say who cares and find something else to do with your time. Those are really the only two options. And writing is a compulsion for me. It's been part of my life for more than 20 years. I'm not going to stop. So I guess, are you going to stop? Do you think, is this feeling of who cares bad enough for you to stop either trying to write or trying to share it, so then there are no consequences because you're not going to share it anyway, right? How do I get into my head that using 5 gazillion prepositional phrases and 50 trillion commas is not actually what generally works for a story? So, like, seemingly half of the posts here, I've got ADHD, and it's making it damn hard to write an engaging story properly. With me, that primarily comes in the form of writing a bunch of prepositionals in practically every sentence. An example that was explicitly called out as such here. Feeling as if despair would consume him if he kept looking at the horde arrayed against him and his people, Fern turned around to look at the city, that bastions of resistance against the Grand Master's tyranny and site of so many sacrifices and legendary deeds that would never be sung about except in the afterlife. I'd happily agree that this is a beast of a sentence. I'd also happily apply the term masturbatory description to it. Whoever provided feedback on the piece I posted here, thanks for the term. I'm running with it in my self-feedback. It's also what, to me, feels like a natural flow, linking every bit of description immediately to the next. This is, according to feedback I've gotten, absolutely not how people like to read. Now I've rewritten it and reduced the prepositionals and just cut out down half of the fluff in general, and I got this. Firm felt as if despair would consume him if he kept looking at the horde arrayed against his people. He turned around to look at the city. It was sad to know that a site of so many sacrifices and legendary deeds would never be sung about except in the afterlife. Part of me does strongly feel that this is much better. However, an equally large part of my brain is screaming that this is just short and dull and uninteresting. Okay, so short sentences create tension and they create speed. If you go, he dropped the knife, he ran. How do I want to say this? Punctuation and sentence structure change the pacing of the reading and the tension in a scene. He walked into a room where a candle sat on the table, a chair was pulled out, and a delicious dinner of steak and potatoes was plated. That is a longer sentence. It's not as complicated as the sentence is presented here, but it's a longer sentence that kind of has a more meandery feeling to it. Now, if you wanted to a meandery feeling, a calm feeling. Now, if you wanted to make it more tense, that one doesn't have a lot of tension. We're kind of just getting into the scene. If you wanted to say the same thing but have slightly more tension, just think of how it sounds out loud when you go, he walked into the room. A candle sat on the table. A chair pushed in. Dinner, potatoes, steak on a plate. The sharp end changes the tension, it changes the mood, and it shifts the danger feeling depending on how you're using it. When you're talking about punctuation, when you're talking about prepositionals, when you're talking about how long to make a sentence or how short to make a sentence, all of it plays into not only how your sentence looks, but how your sentence feels to be read and the tension in those phrases. One of the ways that I also like to test what I'm working on when I'm reading a sentence to see the flow, to see the tension, is to read it out loud. And that's possibly because I have a theater background, so a lot of what I do has a theatrical feeling to it, and you really manipulate the scenes, the words, the characters in the scene by using the sentence structure to manipulate pacing, to use, how you structure your paragraphs with your paragraph markers to create different pacing. This includes if you have just like super long paragraphs because your character talks in run-on sentences, that's going to show in the way that you'd use them on the page. When you're struggling with these things, my suggestion, always read them out loud to see where those pauses are, because also if you can't get to where your comma is at without taking a breath, then that's usually going to be difficult for the reader to read. You will always write exactly how you talk or very similar to how you talk. I always mention Rick Moody and the one time that he came to my writing program because I could not get into his writing style with all of his commas in his book. I think it was Demonology. But then when he was at my program and he read from his own book, I started to understand how the pacing of his talk worked because I heard him talk, I heard the commas in his voice, and now all of the commas in his writing made sense. So you're always going to talk the way, or write kind of the way that you talk. But that's part of writing prose, is learning how to manipulate the punctuation, the word choices, the little grammar things in order to create the mood that you want or the movement that you want. Because again, if you look at a fighting scene, there's going to be much more tension, much more movement, and it's going to feel faster paced with shorter sentences, as opposed to if you just continually comma, 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 description, comma, comma, and you get lost in it. How do you personally come up with your characters? I'm curious on what other people's processes are. Do you use music, maybe anagrams? Do you do what the voices in your head tell you to do? I would love to hear about how other people come up with their characters. Typically, for me, characters just, I hear them at some point. As crazy as that might sound. With Boom Boom Boom, I was watching Strange Angel, and I really liked Jack Parsons' eccentricity, and I was like, I want to make a character that's like that. And then slowly but surely, I got an image of a character in my head, and I got a little bit of his voice, and then that's how Jan was born, and Jan is the central character for my current work in progress, Boom Boom Boom. With Joey, it was a lot of just hearing her voice. Right now, I'm currently developing another story that just sort of came about. So a couple months ago now, I heard this song, and I was inspired by the song, but I didn't know for what. I just knew that something was going to come out of this. And then randomly, during the last week, the song came on in the morning, and I listened to it for like 3 or 4 hours. And then all of a sudden, yes, on repeat, tell me if this is you too, but I was just jamming out, rocking to it, and this character started to form in my head, this idea of this character, and then I got this voice, and so I wrote down a paragraph of this character's voice, and that's pretty much how the character started. I don't know anything about the storyline. I just know there's a hearse involved. I know that people around him die. He doesn't really know why, and so then he doesn't really talk to people because people that get to know him kind of just die on him. And so he's kind of disassociated with the world around him, and he sells coffins. That's pretty much all I know. But I've got a voice, and it just comes. I'm trying to think, what else? Usually it's just voices, or I'm inspired by something random. Like my writing partner will come up with, hey, I want to write a character that's like this. And so he'll say a character type, and then that'll spawn me creating a balanced character type. He mentioned wanting to make a storm chaser character, and then all of a sudden I was like, okay. And then 2 days later, my brain was like, okay, so I'm going to make a demigod who's related to weather. So it just kind of cross between listening and just randomly seeing things that are inspiration. I can't really describe it. I was also at an antique store the other day, and somebody came in to relieve the cashier, and they said, extremely grateful. And that reminded me of a short story I have that is called Fucking Perfect, when it's a story about a girl named Perfect, and names create expectations. You know, nobody expects Greg to get an A, but they do expect her to get a 110% because her name is Perfect. And every dude in the school wants to have sex with her because then they can tell their friends they're fucking perfect. And so then, like, listening to these people come into the shop and go extremely grateful, I'm like, oh, that's a story. Kind of like Brutally Frank, also a story. There are just like phrases or feelings that like create a vibe or immediately create a character in my head, and I'm not entirely sure why. And then that's usually where I play more with revision, and I really like revision because now I have, once I get to revision, now I've got a roadmap of where I'm going, and I've got kind of my list of characters. And so revision is often for fixing the story, fixing cringy lines, and bringing out the characters more and more. So that's how I do it. What about you? How do you guys create characters? Where does your character inspiration come from? Do you have to do any specific rituals to get your characters to come out? Do you plot all of your characters before you start writing? How well do you know them before you start writing? very interested because everybody does their characters a little bit differently. How to deal with writing style being disliked by the ones you love. Hello, everyone. I've been writing on a regular basis for almost a decade now, and for most of this time, I used to post my writings online. Because I started feeling too pressured by the online community, I eventually stopped posting them and started to write for myself. However, writing is a big part of my life and personality, so when I become close to someone, I feel the need to share at least a little bit of the text with them. Thus, lately I've decided it was time for me to share my texts with close friends who knew about my hobby, and I didn't expect the reactions I've gotten. As you can guess from the title of this post, they didn't like my writing style, and by that I mean they hated it. They criticized it for being too complicated, which I can concede, and for being extremely pompous, which I can understand too, but hardly without being hurt. I'm trying my utmost to take those comments objectively, but I've realized it's much harder when it comes from my friends, above all, who share the same tastes in literature as mine, than it was to come from complete strangers. It's even more harder when you expect from them support in the hard path that writing represents. So, how do you deal with your writing style being disliked by the ones that you love? Number one, the question that you should always ask yourself is, are your friends your target audience? Because if you're writing, especially for publication, toward publication, for entertainment purposes, you're going to have a target audience. I don't expect any of my friends or family to like what I write, especially certain ideas, because they're so far out of my friends and family's comfort zones in some cases. Number two is you really need to hit home that just because somebody doesn't like what you're writing, your stuff isn't to their taste, it doesn't mean they don't like you. Writing is especially writing commercially is a completely different beast than your friendship or your partnership. There are many people that are married that they don't share their writing with their partner because their partner's not interested or for some other reason. And whether your friends or your family purchase or enjoy your writing should not influence your relationship with them or whether they support you or not. If they're not saying don't do it, I would pretty much say that's fairly supportive on their part, because there are many reasons why your friends or family may not like the way that you've written. One, again, they're not your target audience. Two, if they read, do you not want them to be honest with you if it's not in their thing? This is one of the reasons why I will always say you should never try to force friends or family or cohorts into reading your work, your commercial work, to give you a response, because they may not be in your genre, your target readership. And so if you force them to read your work to be supportive, then you're going to end up with some bad reviews or bad responses, because it's either lie or tell you the truth. And they're just not in your genre. You just don't associate whether somebody enjoys your work with friendship or not. Would you associate somebody liking your work with, oh, they care about you and they love you and they want to be your friend? I don't know if that's necessarily healthy either. But this kind of goes back to an earlier comment that was talking about critiques, taking critiques personally, and you should never take critiques personally. They're not at you, and if they are at you by a stranger, then they're kind of an asshat and they don't need to be taken personally anyway. But any critique that you get, like the user in here said they could concede that it was too complicated and extremely pompous, they could understand that. Okay, so look at the objective parts of this and take what you can and what you might agree with to look over your manuscript and rewrite whatever you need, but also recognize that your friends and family are not necessarily your target audience, and you don't need to please them, and they don't need to like what you're writing. They can just say, okay, cool that you're doing that. I think you're going to get into some big personal letdowns and possibly scare off your friends if you tie them purchasing and or enjoying your work to your friendship, because now you're expecting a lot from people in ways that feel kind of overbearing, in my opinion. But that's just me. Let me know what you think in the comments down below. That will be the end of the questions for today. I would love to hear all of your thoughts on any or all of the above, because I mean, some interesting stuff for sure, but also I definitely want to hear about how you create characters, because that's an interesting thing. With all that said, thank you so much for watching. If you enjoy this kind of video, please remember to like, share, subscribe for more like this, or other topics. And until next time, thank you so much for being here, and don't die.
The only people who should come are those who want to meet their monsters.
If this is what Agatha wants, I don't know how we can even dispute it.
Show me your teeth.
I change lives, baby.
And I end them. Sweetheart, no bargains hold. Only fools know restraint.
Only losers lose!
If your scissors are dull, may I recommend sharpening them with leather?
I think I hit you.
Mima says I must have a guardian angel.
To enter the ring but abstain from playing is suicidal. Your virtue makes you nothing but a liability.
You're gonna die. You're gonna die. You're gonna die.